So the matter of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, even though we're at this prestigious university, shouldn't be seen as something that's academically removed from us, or some kind of a historical investigation, or perhaps some kind of theological matter that may or may not pertain to us as it's related to reality. No, the gospel message, whether or not Jesus died and rose from the dead and who he claimed to be, has such an impact in our lives that I dare say it's the question that has the greatest implication. What you do with the question, who is Jesus and did he rise from the dead, is perhaps the most important thing you will ever do in your life. Now, in my case, I believed not that Jesus had risen from the dead when I was a child. Far from it. I was raised as a Muslim here in the United States. And the idea that Jesus even died on the cross was contrary to what I had been taught. And in fact, a position that I had argued from childhood was that, of course, Jesus didn't die on the cross. If he didn't die, he couldn't have risen from the dead. So it wasn't just something incidental to my beliefs as a Muslim. I vehemently argued that Jesus didn't die on the cross. And yet I stand here before you specifically because the evidence of Jesus' death and resurrection was that compelling to me. I want to emphasize that again. It was the evidence that got me to move into the direction of accepting whether or not Jesus had died and risen from the dead. Islam to me was a religion I loved. It was a religion I loved following. It was a religion of my family. And for me, it would cost a lot to accept this message of Easter. But the evidence was that compelling, and I hope to present that information to you today. If you're wrestling with these matters, I'm here to assure you that the evidence is quite strong. Now, some people might say, Nabil, the idea of Jesus rising from the dead, how could that possibly be something that we can investigate historically? And this is a pretty common assertion, that historians can only investigate that which falls under the realm of naturalism. The idea of whether Jesus had risen from the dead or not falls outside of that question. And in fact, there was an author very recently who wrote a book. The book's called Zealot. The author's name is Reza Aslan. He's a Muslim scholar in the southwestern part of the United States. He argues that exact same thing. As a Muslim, he argues that if you believe Jesus has risen from the dead, you're believing in something that requires faith. It's not a good historical assertion. Well, is that really the case? We know back from the Enlightenment era that Hume argued similar matters, that any kind of miracle cannot be argued from an evidential or historical perspective. And even to today, Hume's thought keeps impacting biblical scholars. Reza Aslan is not one, but people like Bart Ehrman have argued on the record that you cannot investigate the resurrection historically. It's a miracle if it happened, and miracles are outside the realm of history. So right off the bat, before we dive into these things, it's important that we clarify our semantics, because unless we're on the same page, we're not going to be able to move forward. How we're defining history today is those set of events that happened in the past. That set of events that happened in the past, that's history. The narrow definition of history, that set of events which we can only explain naturalistically, is what a lot of historians assume before they address the question. Well, you can see the problem right off the bat. If historians assume that history has to be done naturalistically, apart from any miracles, then before you've even looked at the question, did Jesus rise from the dead, you've already answered it by saying, no, that's not a historical thing we can take a look at. Are you with me so far? The lights are pretty bright, but I can see you, and I'm going to be using you to gauge whether you're following me or not. So far, are we together on this one? So unless you employ circular reasoning and you say that Jesus' death and resurrection cannot be investigated and proven by history, we do have good reason to be able to say that if the resurrection is the best, and definitely if it's the only, explanation of the facts, then we have good reason to accept the resurrection as a historical conclusion. And that's the position that I'm going to be taking today. The last thing I'm going to look at before delving into the evidence is, what about this idea of faith and religion? What about that? Because the Protestant motto has been, it's by grace and faith alone that we are saved. Saved by faith in the grace of Jesus. So how is it possible that we can turn to evidence in order to look and see whether or not we should believe in Christianity? Shouldn't we just believe by faith? This is an inappropriate definition of faith. It's patently unbiblical. The Bible says that we're supposed to have good reasons for the faith that we have. And in case anyone asks us for our faith, we should have an answer or a defense to be able to give for our faith. This is a commonly quoted verse of the New Testament, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. You need to have reasons for the faith you have so that you can share those reasons with other people. How compelling is it when someone tells you to believe in Christianity and they say, why? And you say, oh, you should just believe it, just have faith. It's not what the Bible tells us. And in fact, that was a large part of the problem I had growing up when I was a Muslim. I used to encounter Christian after Christian after Christian. When I challenged them on whether or not Christianity was true, they would just say, well, that's what I believe. I say, well, okay, so it's what you believe, but why are you asking me to then believe it if you don't have good reason? Now, I extrapolate that kind of question to things like the Trinity. If you really want to give a Christian a run for their money, just ask them to define the Trinity. And they'll say, well, the Trinity is the idea that God is 3 in 1. What does that mean? It's a mystery. No, the only mystery here is why you believe this. God is 3 in 1. What is he, a shampoo bottle? No, give me the explanation of what Jesus is. And so, as I'm investigating Christianity, I'm running into these problems that people are not willing to give an explanation for their faith. And I'm challenging you here today, if you are a Christian, make sure you stand by that command of 1 Peter 3:15 to be ready to give a defense for the faith that you have. Now, the resurrection is pivotal for that. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 14 and 17, he says, if Jesus is not risen, our faith is in vain, and we are of all people most to be pitied. Notice he's not saying whether Jesus is risen or not, this belief helps us get through life, which is how a lot of people interpret religion, as a crutch to help you get through life, as a crutch to help you deal with death. That's not what Paul is saying. Paul is saying the exact opposite. If this did not happen, if Jesus is not risen, our faith is in vain, and we are of all people most to be pitied. We're deluded. We're following a lie if Jesus is not risen. So you take a look at what Paul's asserting, and he is saying that the resurrection is the linchpin of the Christian faith. Well, what about those in the book of Acts? What about Jesus? What do they have to say about the resurrection? In the book of Acts, when people start preaching the gospel, what you don't hear them saying is, do you know you're going to get to heaven? Do you want to be saved? Do you want to live a better life? That's not the kind of thing they're saying. You see, the very first sermon from Peter in Acts chapter 2 was explicitly about, at its culmination, the resurrection. This man, Jesus, has risen from the dead. Repent and be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. The resurrection. As you continue through the book of Acts, time after time after time, it's the resurrection that people are pointing to. And you might ask me, well, Nabil, what if it's just to a specific audience? You know, Peter was talking to the Jews in that occasion. Maybe the Jews are thinking about resurrection in a certain way, and therefore it's Peter just addressing the Jews. No, interestingly enough, the first time we see something on a scale towards philosophers and towards thinkers in the Greco-Roman world is in Acts chapter 17. And here Paul is in Athens, in the Areopagus. He's speaking to not Jews, but exactly to Greco-Romans, to Stoics. As Paul goes along, he even quotes basically Greco-Roman poetry. Menander is quoted there. You also see some things that are said which are very close to the writings of Seneca, a Stoic philosopher. So you see Paul interacting with Greco-Roman poetry and philosophy, but as he does that, the culminating message once again is Jesus' resurrection. We believe in this because this man, Jesus, rose from the dead. Now, how does it work? How does it work? Jesus himself was asked the question. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus was asked the question, why should we listen to you? Essentially, that's what the question was asking. People were, literally, so I can be more accurate to the source, people were saying to Jesus, Jesus, show us a sign. Show us a sign for why we should listen to the kinds of things you're saying. Jesus had just exorcised a demon-possessed boy. So they're like, show us a sign. He's like, did you not see what he just exorcised a demon? And then he responds to them and he says, an evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign. Essentially, you're ignoring this. I will not give you any sign except for the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so shall the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth. What is Jesus saying? He's saying, I'm going to give you one proof for the claims I am stating, and that is that as Jonah was apparently dead in the heart of a whale, I am going to be dead in the belly of the earth. Sheol is the word that's used. Sheol is the Hebrew word for the grave. But then I'm going to return. Just as Jonah returned, I am going to return. The resurrection is Jesus' statement, his proof, his epistemically provided evidence that he is actually who he claims to be. The fact of the matter is, there are a lot of religious claims where people can be just given a set of beliefs. I remember when I was talking to a Buddhist. This was my friend. I went to Old Dominion University for my undergraduate, and I had a Buddhist friend named Zach. And one day I asked Zach, and this is while I was preaching Islam to him, and I said, Zach, I've given you good reasons to accept Islam. Why should I be a Buddhist? Why should I accept the faith that you follow? Can you give me your reasons? And he said, Nabil, I don't think you're seeing Buddhism correctly. Buddhism isn't the kind of religion that provides people reasons to believe it. It's a path that you can follow, and if you choose to follow it, you can. And I said, well, thank you. I won't. Because I need a reason to change everything that I'm doing to follow what you're doing. I need it to at least be better somehow, or to be grounded in some kind of truth. And Buddhism isn't that kind of religion, or philosophy if you want to call it. Hinduism is the same thing. It's not providing you any kind of epistemic proof for its claims. And frankly, Judaism works in the same direction. Judaism works off of testimony from further back, what people have said and passed down to their children. If you remember in the book of Joshua, it's told for people to build altars of rocks so that they can pass to their children the things that God had done. But at no point are they challenging others to find evidence for their faith. This is something that's very limited to a few religious beliefs, and Christianity is one of them. Now, you would rightly be critiquing me right now if you said, Nabil, you're quoting the Bible pretty willy-nilly. I'm not a Christian. I don't believe in the inspiration of the Bible. Why should I accept these references that you are giving? Fair enough. And that was, in fact, the exact same challenge I gave when I was a Muslim. I don't believe in the Bible. I don't believe in its reliability. So why should I listen to the quotations you're providing? Let's look at the nature of the evidence, the historical evidence that we're going to use to build the case for the resurrection before continuing. The Bible is not one book. Some people approach the Bible as if it was one writing, and if it's biased, we throw it out, we can't use it. That is a very short-sighted way to see the Bible. The Bible is actually 66 books, 39 Old Testament, and then Jesus comes, and you have 27 New Testament books. Those books have different genres. They say different things in different ways. I'm not saying contradictory things, but they're saying different things in different ways. They have different voices and different genres. For example, you read the book of Ecclesiastes and Lamentations, those two books, you read that differently from how you would read, say, the book of Romans. The book of Romans is a book on theology. Ecclesiastes, parts of Psalms, Lamentations, are a book of the expression of the human heart. You read the book of the Gospels separately from the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is a book of prophecy, whereas the Gospels are Greco-Roman bioi, they're historical biographies. So they have different genres. You don't approach them the same way. To do so would be to inappropriately approach the Bible in hermeneutics. Different books are intended to be read in different ways. And so let's just say, for example, and I'm not arguing this, but let's just say that someone said, Nabil, I can't trust the book of Genesis. It says that the universe was made in 6 days, and I can't trust that kind of thing. Okay, fair enough. But that doesn't affect the reliability from a historical perspective of the four Gospels. You see where I'm going with this? The four Gospels were written later by different people in a totally different genre. So let's not inappropriately equate two books and impute one to the other. So first, the Bible, multiple books written by multiple authors. Well, what about that then? Are these reliable still? I haven't answered the question whether any of these are historically reliable. We need to assess the weight of these evidences for what they're worth. The New Testament, like I said, 27 books. The first 5 of those purport to be historical records. From Matthew to Mark to Luke to John, and in the book of Acts, which is actually Luke part B. The same author wrote that second. So it's often called Luke Acts. Those 5 books are attempting to provide historical evidence. So like any book of history then, we should weigh them for their historical records. How far removed are they from Jesus, whom they're reporting about? Jesus lived somewhere between, or he died somewhere between 30 and 33 AD. The Gospel of Mark, which is the first of the four Gospels to have been written, is at latest dated 72 AD. At latest. A lot of scholars, I as well, am very comfortable dating it around 50 AD, mid-50s, late 50s, somewhere around there. Some people move it even earlier, and they have good reason to do that, by the way. If you have any questions about this, we're going to have a Q&A time. I think there's good reasons to see portions of the Gospel of Mark coming from the 30s, so within 10 years of Jesus' death. But I'm trying to be as amenable to the skeptics as possible and say, even if it is 40 years after Jesus died, that's still within the lifetime of his companions. It's still within the lifetimes of the community of people living around Jesus. And so if the early Christian community is passing this stuff around, they are there to correct any kind of historical inaccuracies. They're still alive. Matthew and Luke come within the next few decades. John is written somewhere between 90 to 95 AD. Again, at the latest. Some of the greatest biblical scholars alive today, such as Daniel Wallace, who's at Dallas Theological Seminary, he would put the Gospel of John no later than the mid-60s. So some people even put it that early, but at the latest, people put it at 90 to 95 AD. That's within 60 years of Jesus' life. And we know people like Polycarp, like John, lived into their 90s and 100s, so there are people still alive from Jesus' time, even when John's Gospel is being written. That's the nature of the biblical authorship here, of the Gospels, what we're taking a look at. Now, to juxtapose this, to compare this with other books, let's take a figure from ancient history who's very well known, Alexander the Great. The first major biography written about Alexander the Great came 400 years after he died. So you compare something like 40 years to 400 years, there's no comparison. Now, I'm giving you 40 years for the Gospel of Mark, but the fact of the matter is the Gospels aren't the only things we can use for the historical evidence here, and we are going to use more. There was somebody who wrote even before the Gospel of Mark was written. His name's Paul. Paul wrote letters which obviously were written before he died. Kind of hard to write them posthumously, unless he too had risen from the dead, but that's not the investigation tonight. Paul's letters, therefore, are written earlier than 65 AD. Some of his writings, though, contain doctrines and codified proclamations from the early church that he was quoting. So, for example, if I quote something in a letter, let's say I quote the preamble, or if I quote the Bill of Rights, whatever, I quote something from the late 18th century in my writing, that's still from before. Even though my writing is from the 21st century, I'm quoting something from earlier than that. Paul does the exact same thing in some of his writings. One of these is a very well-known creed from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8. Let me give you the context here. A group of scholars who are not Christian, or at least not Orthodox Christian, they're called the Jesus Seminar. Many of these people are atheists and agnostic, and they attempt to revisit what the New Testament says and how accurate it actually is. So these are people who publish some of the most anti-Christian literature that's out there. They were investigating the New Testament to grade whether certain verses are historically reliable and whether certain verses are not. When they came to 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, they concluded that these verses are so early that they come from within a decade of Jesus' death. Like I said, these are not Christian scholars, or at least not what we think of when we think of Christian scholars. They're saying within a decade or so of Jesus' death. Now, some scholars who are very highly respected, such as James D.G. Dunn, he's a retired professor from Durham University in the UK. He goes much further. He says that 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, is in fact so early that we can be virtually certain that it was codified within months of Jesus' death. Can we compare 400 years on Alexander the Great to months after Jesus' death? That's about as fast as anything can possibly be from historical times. And if you want me to read for you what 1 Corinthians 15 says in these verses, I will do so. It says this, Paul says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." Scholars have concluded, James D.G. Dunn, one of them, that this comes from within months after Jesus' death. What is it saying? It is saying that Jesus died and rose from the dead. Now that doesn't mean this is automatically true, just because it comes from within months after Jesus' death. That doesn't mean it's automatically true. But what it does mean is the community is preaching Jesus' death and resurrection that soon after he was crucified. And the people who were around at the time of his ministry, the people who claim to have seen him, are still there. Which is why Paul says he appeared to the 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. Why does he put that qualifier in there, most of whom are still alive? Well, he's telling them, look, if you want to see people who have seen the risen Jesus, go verify what I'm saying. Let their testimony be proof for you that this happened. So, what is the nature of the evidence we're looking at tonight? I still haven't gotten to the point where we build a case yet. We're just taking a look at the nature of the evidence. Do we throw out the Bible beforehand? No. We see it as historical documents, or at least those parts that purport to be historical. Then we weigh them for how reliable they are. We try to sift past their biases, just like we would for any historical document. And we also have portions that are so early that they're within months, theoretically, after Jesus died, or perhaps a decade or so, but still a newsflash according to ancient standards. That's the strength of the historical testimony for what we're going to be looking at tonight. So now that we've seen kind of the weight of the historical records, and we've taken a look at whether or not we can actually investigate the question, let's take a look at the actual argument. The argument that I'm going to provide for you comes from two scholars, very highly acclaimed scholars within certain circles. One is a distinguished professor at Liberty University. The other is a professor at Houston Baptist University. Their names are Gary Habermas and Michael Licona. Gary Habermas is an amazing man. He himself went through an extended period of doubt regarding the resurrection, and he made it his doctoral research to investigate the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection in the mid-70s. Since then, he has read every single scholarly article on the resurrection and on the death of Jesus, printed in English, French, and German. He's got a lot of time on his hands, apparently. So he goes through every one in all those three languages, and he catalogs what all these scholars believe. Over 3,500 articles he's read, cataloging what scholars believe. Now, which scholars is he referring to? Atheist, agnostic, skeptical, Hindu, Jewish, Christian, across the theological spectrum. He takes what all of them write, and he catalogs what they conclude. What he has found is that certain facts about Jesus' death and resurrection, or at least the time surrounding his death and resurrection, are so commonly adhered to, not just by Christians, but by non-Christian scholars, that they're virtually unanimous amongst those who are studying the historical Jesus. Once again, there are certain things that pretty much everyone who studies Jesus agrees about Jesus. One of those facts is that Jesus died by crucifixion. About Jesus' death by crucifixion, you have scholars across the board, once again, who agree that it happened. People like Paula Fredrickson, who's an agnostic or an atheist. You have people like Marcus Borg, Bart Ehrman, who's himself agnostic, saying things like this, that Jesus died by crucifixion is as sure as any historical fact can be. If there's anything we can know about the historical Jesus life, it's that he died by crucifixion. So the scholars across the board are saying fact number one, Jesus died by crucifixion. Fact number two that Gary Habermas points out is that the disciples of Jesus truly believed he had risen from the dead. The disciples truly believed Jesus had risen from the dead. Again, that doesn't mean he had risen from the dead, but they actually believed it. They weren't lying about it. And fact number 3, that not just the disciples of Jesus believed that he had risen from the dead, but enemies of Jesus, specifically Paul, who was Saul of Tarsus, who was arresting Christians at the time, and also those who didn't follow Jesus, such as James, his brother. We know from the Gospels that James was not a follower of Jesus during his lifetime, and yet all of a sudden he becomes a follower of Jesus to when he's willing to die for the fact that Jesus had risen and appeared. So these 3 facts, Gary argues, as well as Michael Licona, argue that are solidly established within the historical record. So let's take a look at the reasons why we can believe that these 3 facts occurred. Fact number 1, did Jesus die by crucifixion or not? The process of crucifixion during Roman history was so thorough that no one in all of Roman history that's been recorded ever survived a full crucifixion. Not one person ever survived a full crucifixion. Why? Let's take a look at what a crucifixion is. When someone is going to be crucified, and I'm sorry if this gets a bit graphic, but the fact of the matter is there are people who deny the death of Jesus on the cross. I was one of them. Throughout my young adulthood, I denied that Jesus died on the cross. But when I saw this evidence, for me, this was so compelling that it challenged me, it shook me to my core. Because the Quran says Jesus did not die by crucifixion, and yet here was the evidence. Here, take a listen to this. The process of crucifixion starts off with flogging, and we see from the Gospels that Jesus was also flogged, and this is a normal for the crucifixion process. The flogging involves using a Roman flagrum, a whip. This whip has multiple leather cords that come off of it. Each of these leather cords has multiple leather balls, which on those leather balls have metal dumbbells and shards of sheep bone. So you've got a whip, multiple cords, leather balls with metal dumbbells and shards of sheep bone. The victim is then tied to a flogging post, and this whip is used to hit the victim repeatedly. The whip is designed the way it is because the metal dumbbells cause vasodilation of the blood vessels near the skin. The blood vessels dilate, pain receptors and chemicals are brought closer to the surface of the skin. It's going to hurt a lot, and you're going to bleed a lot. They were very systematic in the way they designed their crucifixion process. The sheep bone was then designed to reach into the skin, latch onto it, and rip it out. People would bleed to death by the flogging process. Some people's intestines fell out during the flogging process because the whip would reach around to their abdomen, weaken the abdominal wall to the point where the intestines fell out. Cicero records that people's arteries and veins were laid bare during the flogging process. That's why it was called the pre-death. People died during the flogging alone. It's also interesting to note that the people who were doing this to Jesus were not Jewish at this point. These were the Roman soldiers who were flogging Jesus. And the reason why that's important to note is because Jews had a law from the mitzvot, from the Old Testament, that they were not to flog anyone more than 40 times. So Jews would have someone actually counting. As they were flogging, they'd have someone counting how many times a person was flogged. And once they got to 39, they would stop, just in case someone had miscounted. They wanted to make absolutely sure no one broke God's law and went to 40 or 41. Romans, especially at this time, were very spiteful of the Jews. And so oftentimes they'd get to 40 and start whipping even more, just to spite the Jews and their laws. And so the fact that Jesus was being flogged by Romans makes us think there's a chance that his flogging was worse than the average flogging. And there's more reason to think that, actually, because you look at the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, it's pretty clear that Pilate, the person who's crucifying and flogging Jesus, doesn't want Jesus to die. He's trying to release him. So he tells the crowd, look, I've crucified him, I've flogged him, isn't that enough? Isn't that enough? Now, of course, they were expecting him to be flogged already, so what sense does it make for him to say, oh, he's flogged, isn't that enough? It would only make sense if he had flogged him worse than they were expecting. So we have good reason to believe, for two separate reasons, that Jesus was flogged worse than the average person. And as Cicero has said, it's one of the most gruesome processes. If any of you want more information on the crucifixion process, read Martin Hengel's book, Crucifixion. he provides some historical records in there that are so compelling. For example, no one other than Roman non-citizens were allowed to be flogged and crucified. The crucifixion process was so bad that citizens weren't allowed to be crucified. In fact, people have said, let no Roman even think the word crucifixion. That's how painful and devastating and humiliating the flogging and crucifixion process is. But it's not done yet. After a person's skin is hanging off from them in ribbons, they are then placed on a cross. Now that's not a gentle process by any means. A person was often made to carry the crossbeam through the streets as a sign of additional humiliation. Look, they could kill you by beheading you if they wanted to. The crucifixion process is designed to humiliate you and weaken you and prolong the process of death. And so Jesus is carrying the crossbeam to the place of his crucifixion. And of course that happens while he's bleeding and naked. They don't allow any clothes while that's happening. Once they get to the place of the crucifixion, their hands are nailed. And hands in that time applied to anything from your fingertips to your wrists. They were nailed right here through the ulna and the radius, because that's where your weight could be sustained while you're hanging. Nailed through there. There's a nerve that runs there. It's called the median nerve. This is the major sensory motor nerve of your arm. If you pierce that nerve, your hand is immediately incapacitated. And if you can imagine tapping your funny bone and how much pain that causes, imagine piercing a nail through it. There's a reason why they had to invent a word to describe the crucifixion process and how painful it is. The word excruciating means ex cruce, off the cross. This is an excruciating process. You've got nails driven through both sides here, and then you have a 7-inch nail driven through your feet. The reason why a nail is driven through your feet is because if they hang you up by just your arms, you're going to hang and you're not going to be able to breathe out after a while. You're not going to have the strength to pull yourself up in order to breathe. You hang, your rib cage is extended, you don't have the ability to provide that negative pressure to breathe in, and you're going to die of asphyxiation. So what they do is they nail you through your feet so you can push up off your feet to continue breathing. This is not a mercy. It prolongs the death of someone until they decide to finish you off. When they do that, there are multiple ways, but there was always a Roman death blow involved in the process of the crucifixion. These death blows sometimes looked like knees being broken. You see in the Gospels that the people next to Jesus, their knees are broken. Why is that? Because if you break someone's knees, they can no longer push up in order to breathe. So they die by suffocating. Or sometimes bodies were lit on fire while still on the cross. In fact, when the Jews were revolting after Jesus' death, right before the temple was destroyed, one of the things that the Romans did was they crucified Jews in various positions and lit their bodies on fire all around the city of Jerusalem. It said that their bodies lit up the place like torches. People's bodies would be lit on fire. Sometimes people's bodies would be taken down and thrown to a pit of dogs, and the dogs would eat them. In fact, scholar John Dominic Crossan says this is likely what happened to Jesus. He's a member of the Jesus Seminar. You can tell he's not Christian belief. He says that Jesus' body was fed to dogs. Sometimes people's heads were crushed. Now Jesus, what happened to him? He was speared through the heart. That was the death blow administered to Jesus. The Romans are making absolutely sure you die by this process. And like I said, not a single person ever survived a full Roman crucifixion. I throw the word full in there because one person is recorded to have survived a partial crucifixion. He was put up on the cross and immediately taken down because a general saw him and recognized him as a friend. So he said, "Take him down." This was Josephus. They took him down, gave him the best medical treatment they had. In fact, 3 were taken down at once. 2 of them died. 1 survived. That's the only person ever recorded to survive any part of a crucifixion, but no one ever survived a full Roman crucifixion. For these reasons, scholars take a look at the evidence and they conclude across the board, Jesus died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. And I do want to take a moment here to bring in some extra biblical evidence. This isn't just records found in the Bible. You have people outside the Bible, Jews, Romans, and Greeks outside the Bible, non-Christians, who are saying that Jesus died by crucifixion. Lucian of Samosata, for example, Josephus, the Talmud, Marabar Serapion, who is also a Jew. All these people are saying that Jesus died by crucifixion. None of them are Christians. All of them are early. None of that's from the Bible. So we have extra-biblical, non-Christian evidence that corroborates this, which is why it is such a strong claim. Fact number one, Jesus died by crucifixion. Fact number two, the disciples truly believed Jesus had been risen. Now the disciples were at one time so afraid of fighting and dying that they ran away from Jesus. They ran from him. They weren't willing to stick around when Jesus was being arrested. But something happened. And shortly after Jesus' crucifixion, these people are so willing to say that Jesus had risen and appeared to them that they're all transformed to the point where they're willing to die for this belief. They're willing to die for the sake that Jesus had risen and appeared to them. Something transformed them from essentially cowards to essentially bold enough to not be afraid of death. What was it? What could that possibly be? Now they're saying it was the resurrection. They saw the author of life himself risen from the dead. That's why they had that kind of boldness to die, because they know death had been defeated. But on top of that, we have other reason to believe that they were telling the truth. And that is something very pithy that Mike Licona says. He says, liars make poor martyrs. Liars make poor martyrs. They died for their beliefs. Now, someone might say, Nabil, people die for their beliefs all the time. We saw people in 9/11 willing to kill themselves for the sake of their beliefs. Are they right too? That's not the point I'm making. Because what people believe today and are willing to die for is usually beliefs that were taught to them from the ancient past. The disciples were testifying to something they would have seen with their own eyes. Not something that they had been taught, something they would know to be true or not. And that's why they make poor martyrs, and they're probably not lying. If they were lying, they'd make poor martyrs. So, did the disciples honestly believe Jesus had risen from the dead? Across the board, Gary Habermas has said over 90% of the scholars who study this say yes, and we've just provided the reasons. Finally, fact number three, did enemies of Jesus believe that he had risen and appeared to them? Now, Paul, like I said earlier, was someone who was arresting Christians. He had no reason to accept or want to see the risen Jesus. He hadn't followed Jesus. He hadn't been one of his disciples. In fact, he was a student of a top rabbi of the time, Gamaliel, one of the highest rabbis, and he was one of his best students. He had power coming his way. He had plenty of reason to want to stay within the Orthodox sect of Judaism and not follow this new Christian subsection of Jews. So why in the world would he have been willing to die, and in fact did die, for the claim that Jesus had risen from the dead? Once again, the argument is made that he truly believed Jesus had risen from the dead. Now, whether he's right or not, we haven't gotten to yet. But he at least truly believed Jesus had risen from the dead. And James as well, the brother of Jesus. You take a look at Mark chapter 6, and what you find is that Jesus' family is not following him. Jesus' family is not one of those who is agreeing with the early Christian community. They're saying Jesus is out of his mind. But James, the brother of Jesus, we see in the book of Acts, and we also see from extra-biblical evidence, that James, in fact, was not just a follower of Jesus, he became a leader of the church in Jerusalem. And then he was killed for believing Jesus had risen from the dead. The evidence that he was killed is found extra-biblically, like I said, in Josephus, in the 2nd century Hegesippus as well. We have good records showing that James and Paul, neither of which were following Jesus, were willing to go to their death for the fact that Jesus had risen. Therefore, they believed Jesus had truly risen. Are you with me so far on these three facts? Jesus died by crucifixion. The disciples truly believed he had risen from the dead, and the enemies of Jesus truly believed he had risen from the dead. Here is the job of a historian, and this is where we draw everything together. The job of a historian is to take evidence and facts from history and provide an account that best explains those facts. You see an array of facts. What theory best explains those facts? If you have a theory that strains the facts, that's a bad historical conclusion. If you have a theory that accounts for the facts very well and comfortably, that's a good historical conclusion. Now, it should be said up front, no theory accounts for all the facts perfectly. but some definitely account for the facts better than other theories do. So what theory can best account for these three facts that we have just investigated, that virtually all scholars across the board who study this matter are in agreement with? I'm positing tonight, based on the minimal facts argument of Habermas and Lakota, that the only hypothesis that answers these facts well is the resurrection. No other hypothesis comes even close to explaining these facts. That's my argument tonight. Now let's assess that for a moment. The hypothesis of the resurrection. Does it explain fact number one, that Jesus died on the cross? Yes, it accounts for that. Jesus died on the cross. Number two, does it explain that the disciples of Jesus truly believed that they had seen him risen? Yes, it does. If Jesus rose from the dead and they saw him, that explains why they truly believed that they had seen him. Fact number three, does it explain that enemies of Jesus truly believed that they had seen him risen? Yes, once again, if Jesus actually rose from the dead, that accounts for all three of those facts. It accounts also for why enemies of Jesus believed they had seen him risen. Hypothesis number two. Now I'll tell you this. Gary Habermas has said that this hypothesis is the most popular hypothesis after the resurrection, but that said, only 5% of the scholars he surveyed believe in this. It's the most popular after the resurrection, but only 5% of the scholars he surveyed believe in this alternative explanation. It's the hallucination theory, that Jesus' disciples had followed Jesus, and they so wanted to see him risen, that after he died, they saw him risen. And how are they explaining this? Well, it's a true medical phenomenon. When people lose loved ones, they often hallucinate their loved ones' return. They hallucinate that they're back. So, appealing to that medical phenomenon of hallucinations of the recently bereaved, they're saying that the disciples really saw Jesus risen. They believed that they had seen him risen, but it was just a hallucination. Okay, so that's that hypothesis. Does it fit the three facts? Fact number one. If they were just hallucinating, does the fact that Jesus died on the cross fit? Yes, it fits. It fits that theory. Number two, if the disciples were just hallucinating, does it fit the fact that they truly believed they had seen him risen? Well, this is a bit of a stretch. This is a bit of a stretch. Because it's not like there's one person who saw Jesus risen. Like I said, from something that maybe as early as 6 months after Jesus, 500 people at once saw the risen Jesus, or at least believed that they had seen the risen Jesus. So in order to avoid the miracle of the resurrection, you have to create a miracle of a mass hallucination. Doesn't work. Doesn't work. But for the sake of argument, let's just say, okay, fine, it fits fact number two. Let's just say it fits fact number two. Fact number three, the enemies of Jesus truly believed that they had seen him risen. Does this fit? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Under the hypothesis that the disciples really wanted to see Jesus risen, therefore they did, how does that explain the fact that Paul saw the risen Jesus? It doesn't explain that. Paul didn't want to see anything but he wanted to see the risen Jesus. Yet Paul was willing to die for the fact that he had seen the risen Jesus. So the hypothesis that the disciples simply hallucinated doesn't fit the facts. What about the next most common hypothesis? After that, you're going to look at the stolen body theory, that the disciples stole Jesus' body. Well, does that fit fact number one, that Jesus died by crucifixion? Yes, it does. Does it fit fact number two, that the disciples truly believed that they had seen Jesus risen? No. If they stole his body, they didn't truly believe that they had seen him risen. It doesn't fit this fact. And of course, it doesn't fit fact number three either. Why were enemies of Jesus willing to say they had seen him risen if it was just that the body had been stolen? Doesn't fit the facts. All right, what's the next most common hypothesis? And this was the hypothesis that I had believed, that Jesus had simply swooned on the cross. He didn't die, he survived the crucifixion. Does it fit fact number one? No. Fact number one is that he died on the cross. And to argue that he didn't die doesn't fit the facts. But also, it doesn't really fit fact number two either, that the disciples believed he had risen from the dead. Because if the disciples had simply healed Jesus after he had survived the cross, they wouldn't be then willing to die for the proclamation that he had risen from the dead. It doesn't fit the facts. And David Strauss, who was an atheist from the 18th century, was the first person to point this out. Back then, naturalistic explanations were pretty popular to explain what was happening to Jesus. David Strauss, a vocal atheist at the time, which was very rare, said this hypothesis simply does not work because the disciples went from being afraid to proclaiming Jesus the author of life. Now, if Jesus had just barely survived a crucifixion, that doesn't make him the author of life. That doesn't give them enough reason to proclaim the resurrection. And once again, of course, it doesn't quite fit with enemies of Jesus as well. From this point, we start going really downhill on the hypotheses. The next most common hypothesis is the evil twin hypothesis. Jesus had an evil twin who saw this moment to take control and take power, and then apparently disappear. Who knows? That's the next hypothesis, not really a good one. After that, we get into the super alien hypothesis, so it just goes even further downhill. The fact is that the best explanation for the facts surrounding Jesus' death is that he rose from the dead. It's the only explanation that works well. And because it's the only explanation that works well, you have, remember how I said that after the resurrection itself, the next most common hypothesis was only subscribed to by 5% of people. There's a whole host of people in there who say this: we don't know what happened. We don't know what happened. Most of the scholars studying Jesus' life conclude, we simply don't know. There's no historical explanation that can account for these facts. Well, I think there is. It's called the resurrection. Now, the only reason why people would preclude that beforehand is if they say miracles can't count. But if you rule out miracles before you start the investigation, you're not being fair. You are being biased in your research. And you've beforehand precluded the potential, and I would say the best explanation. This is why the same scholar I talked about earlier, Reza Aslan, said this. He said, something extraordinary happened. What exactly that something was is impossible to know. Jesus' resurrection is an exceedingly difficult topic for historians to discuss, not least because it falls beyond the scope of the examination of the historical Jesus. So he's saying what most historians say. But he says, however, there is this nagging fact to consider. One after another, those who claim to have witnessed the risen Jesus went to their own gruesome deaths, refusing to recant their testimony. So even scholars like Reza Aslan, who says, we don't know what happened, he grants the facts. He's just not willing to conclude a resurrection because he thinks that would be a miracle. And I think that's exactly what happened. So, we can at least conclude that there's good reason for Christians to have faith in the resurrection of Jesus because it is the best explanation of the historical evidence. No other explanation approximates this. Now, what I want to leave you with then is the fact that this isn't just an academic lecture. This isn't just a matter we study in order to ascertain the reliability of Christianity or to see why they believe what they believe. This has real ramifications for all of us who are sitting here. If we are living in a world where only natural things happen, and post-Enlightenment, especially in the university settings, it seems to be a popular belief in the West that only natural things happen, that there is no such thing as the supernatural. What this means, what the resurrection means then, is that that is wrong. There's something more to this world, something that can bring people back from the dead. And if that is true, then what that means for you is that if it comes to a point in your life where it seems like there is no hope, if it comes to a point in your life where it seems like even death is inevitable and there's no way to escape it, well, death is not the end. There's more. There's hope no matter what. Now, if it's someone who has risen from the dead, that's what that means. But the fact that it was Jesus who had risen from the dead tells us even more. Because what Jesus had been claiming was that you could live in eternity with God. That He loves you, that God loves you, and that He will provide for you. And His resurrection was the proof He was providing for these claims. Now, if it's true that you have Jesus, He's been risen from the dead, His claims have been proven true, then what that means is that you can be with God for eternity. if you follow Jesus. That means that your life here can be spent, poured out for the sake of others. That means you don't have to be worried about anything in your own life because you're in the hands of a God who's all-powerful and all-loving, who loves you in specific. That filters down to such a high level. Jesus was that person who was willing to spend time with sinners and prostitutes and tax collectors, according to the New Testament. Jesus was that person who was loving even the lowest of the low. So right now we have in Atlanta tens of thousands of people trapped in sex slavery. And I'm telling you, some of the things that keep them there is the constant lie that they are told that they aren't worth anything. They're told that the best use that they have is their body being sold for money. They're being told that verbally, they're being told that by the actions under which they are trapped. And quite frankly, if there is no supernatural, if all we are the chemicals that comprise us, then they're not worth anything more than that. And the most value we can extract from them is utilitarianism, which is what's happening to them. They're spawning this industry by their bodies being sold. But if God, if Jesus, if the gospel message is true, if Jesus' resurrection happened, which provides epistemic basis to believe in the gospel, then that means that even that person caught in sex slavery can believe that they are loved. Not just by anyone, by the God who created the universe. Not just that they are loved, but they're so valuable that God himself would be willing to die for them, and then willing to defeat death for them. No message can give someone more value than that. This has very real ramifications. And for us here, for those of us here who do live in Atlanta, if this message is true, if Jesus is risen from the dead, then we ought to follow him and follow what he says. And what he says is, be willing to suffer and die for the sake of those who need you. Be willing to pour your life out for those who need you. If Jesus died on the cross for the sake of us, which is what he said, and which is what he would have proven if he had risen from the dead, he tells us, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, who is our neighbor? Those very people caught in sex slavery. He gives us a reason to then empty ourselves out for their sake. And this might be hard to swallow, not just for their sake, but the sake of their captors and the criminals as well. We're supposed to love everyone because they are truly valuable and worthy of love. This all becomes true if Jesus is risen from the dead. This has tremendous ramifications, and I think it's an amazing blessing, speaking from a Christian perspective, that God has given us reason to believe in it. He didn't have to, but the history is that strong that we can have solid reason to believe in it, not just have to believe in it by blind faith, but be able to put our claim on this, on the strength of the historical evidence. And based on that, lives are being transformed. Mine is one of them. Mine is one of them. I would have never said anything like this if the case for the resurrection had not been this strong. But because it is, I'm willing to follow Jesus. And the question is, where do you fall? Thank you so much for giving me a hearing. We're going to now go into question and answers. Thanks.
I find it fascinating that atheists dogmatically insist that the message of Christianity is just put your blind faith in our religion, when Christianity, more than any other worldview I'm aware of, has always said, here's how you can know that this is true. In the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul says to the people of Athens, tells them that God has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So if Christians proclaim, here's the proof, why do atheists here just believe without any evidence whatsoever? It's as if hearing they do not hear and seeing they do not see. But for those with ears to hear, knowing that Jesus rose from the dead is actually much simpler than people realize. To know that Jesus rose from the dead, we only need to know two things. One, that he was dead, and two, that he was alive again later. If Jesus was dead and he was alive again later, I'd say that our atheist friends have a great big Son of God-shaped hole in their worldview. I doubt that John and I are going to have any disagreement on whether Jesus was dead, because we've both studied the sources, and Jesus' death by crucifixion is one of the best established facts of ancient history.
Historical full practice of crucifixion ends with killing the person being crucified. It is a historical standard that people die from the practice of crucifixion. The following information supports this case. Ancient historian Josephus says crucifixion is the most wretched of deaths. He mentioned the founder of Christianity went to the crucifixion. Also, if the Roman government orders an execution by crucifixion, Roman soldiers will get killed by the head of government if the Roman soldiers don't carry out their duty to make sure the criminal prisoner's body is killed. If the Roman government orders an execution by crucifixion, Roman soldiers will get killed by the head of government if the Roman soldiers let the body or prisoner escape. Jesus could not have survived the crucifixion. Roman procedures were very careful to eliminate that possibility. Roman law even laid the death penalty on any soldier who let a prisoner escape in any way, including for a crucifixion. Concerning prisoner criminals on the cross who were not dead, the Roman soldiers traditionally broke their legs. Breaking the legs hastened the death so that the corpse could be taken down before the Sabbath. But when they came to Jesus and found that Jesus was already dead, not breathing, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. This is cited in the Bible book of John 19:31-34. Romans struck Jesus' abdomen and blood and water spilled to demonstrate Jesus is dead from loss of extreme amount of blood loss, which is called death by exsanguination, which is the medical term for death by blood loss, thus no oxygen to the body. Pilate asked the Roman centurion if Jesus' body was dead for confirmation, and the Roman centurion said yes. This is cited in the book of Mark 15:44. According to atheist scholars, the earliest discussion of Jesus' death was immediate and was adopted into a short small creed to be recited and taught around 33 AD. The creed mentioned that Jesus died and was raised to life and appeared to the disciples. According to atheist scholar on ancient texts Dr. Gert Ludman, who holds a Ph.D., mentions that this early creed's spoken beliefs date to about 33 AD. Gert Ludman says the elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, not later than 3 years. The formation of the appearance traditions mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3-8 falls into the time between 30 and 33 CE. This was extremely earlier than the writing of the first Gospel of Mark or even any other New Testament book. Later, while Jesus' disciples were still living about 20 years later, the creed was formally written for the spreading to far wider reaches of the land to many countries. The creed was even written before the Gospel of Mark, the earliest Gospel. The Gospel of Mark was written around 60 AD, which was still early enough time to talk with Paul and see if Paul was correct in his teachings and not lying. The disciples double-checked with Paul if Paul was preaching the same gospel message that the disciples were preaching. Paul double-checked and ran the gospel message with Peter for verification so that Paul's message would not be in error or in vain. This is discussed in the book of Galatians 2 verses 1-10, where Paul mentioned that he met with Peter and James and they verified if what Paul was saying aligned with Peter's teaching. One of Jesus' disciples was named John. John's disciple, who was named Polycarp, also fully agreed with Paul's teaching and that it is correct and the same as theirs. Paul did not teach different things.
Meanwhile, even some of the most critical historical Jesus scholars will acknowledge certain facts about Jesus. That he was baptized by John the Baptist, that he had disciples, that he was known as a miracle worker and an exorcist, that he believed he played a crucial role in the coming of the kingdom of God, and of course that he died by crucifixion. The scholarly consensus on Jesus' death arises from having a variety of ancient sources. There are Christian, Jewish, and Roman sources reporting Jesus' death, and knowing how crucifixion works. Today we tend to think of crucifixion as just nailing someone to a cross, but Roman crucifixion was a 3-step process. The first step was the scourging, which was sometimes called the half-death, because victims would be half dead by the time it was finished. The Romans used a flagrum made of leather thongs with chunks of bone and metal woven into the strands, designed for removing human flesh. We have records of people being beaten until their veins and arteries were exposed, or until their bones were showing, or until their intestines spilled out. Julius Caesar remarked, "It is more grievous to be scourged than to be put to death." And that was just the beginning. Step 2 was nailing the victim to a cross and letting him hang there while blood drained out of him. Once he stopped gasping for breath, the Romans knew their work was done. Almost. The Romans didn't take crucifixion lightly, so there was a third step, a death blow, just to make sure their victim was dead. If they needed to pry someone off a cross, they would smash his head in, or stab him through the heart with a sword or a spear, or set him on fire, or let wild animals rip him apart. Not the sort of process anyone's going to walk away from. So Jesus' death isn't simply a point of Christian doctrine, it's a fact of history, as even non-Christian scholars are happy to admit. Atheist New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann declares that Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. John Dominic Crossan of the infamous Jesus Seminar says that there is not the slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Marcus Borg, another member of the Jesus Seminar, states that Jesus' execution is the most certain fact about the historical Jesus. Jewish scholar Pinchas Lapid concludes that Jesus' death by crucifixion is historically certain. According to Paula Fredrickson, a convert to Judaism, the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion. And as everyone's favorite scholarly critic of Christianity, Bart Ehrman, maintains, one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. The real question for us tonight, then, is whether Jesus was alive again. How would we know if Jesus was alive at some point following his execution by the Romans? Same way we know many other things from history. We need witnesses, and we need to know that we can trust these witnesses. Do we have witnesses of the risen Jesus? Yes, lots. Fortunately, they began preaching almost immediately, and we have summaries of some of their early sermons. They issued official creedal statements that could be easily memorized and passed on to others. They sent out representatives with authoritative traditions that would eventually be incorporated into the Gospels and other writings. We also have writings and quotations outside the New Testament from the next generation of Christian leaders, which included people like Clement of Rome and Polycarp, who knew one or more of the apostles and who continued preaching the message of the apostles, especially the resurrection of Jesus. But the most interesting source on the eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus is an early Christian creed recorded in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7. 1 Corinthians was written around AD 55, and Paul says in the letter that he had already delivered the creed to the church in Corinth, which would have been several years earlier. But Paul received the creed long before that, either when he visited the apostles in Jerusalem or perhaps even at his conversion, and scholars date its formulation to within a few years of Jesus' crucifixion. James D.G. Dunn writes, "This tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as tradition within months of Jesus' death." According to Michael Goulder, Paul received the tradition, that is, he was taught it at his conversion perhaps 2 years after Jesus' death. Ulrich Wilkins says that the creed indubitably goes back to the oldest phase of all in the history of primitive Christianity. Gerd Ludemann maintains that the elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Paul Barnett dates the creed to within 2 or 3 years of the first Easter. Richard Burridge and Graham Gould say it dates from only a few years after Jesus' death. Robert Funk in the Jesus Seminar put it within 2 or 3 years at most. Richard Hayes says it originates within about 3 years after Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, and Alexander Wedderburn asserts that it goes back to the first half of the 30s. So there's widespread agreement among scholars that from across the theological spectrum that 1 Corinthians 15 contains very early material that goes right back to the original apostles of Jesus shortly after his death. Let's read the passage. Paul writes, "For I delivered to you, the Christians of Corinth, as of first importance," this is foundational information, "what I also received." Begin creed that Paul received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time. Paul is writing this years later, so he adds parenthetically, "most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles." The original would have ended with the appearance to all the apostles. But Jesus appeared to Paul later, so Paul adds, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. Notice what we have here. We have Jesus' death for sins, his burial, his resurrection on the third day, and numerous appearances. And we have all of it as authoritative tradition within a few years, if not within months, of the crucifixion. As for the appearances, there are appearances to individuals, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and eventually Paul, to small groups, the 12 and all the apostles, and to a large group. He appeared to more than 500. The list also reports appearances to both friends and foes. Peter and the apostles were followers of Jesus during his 3-year ministry, but James and Paul weren't. James didn't believe that his brother was the Messiah when Jesus was preaching in Galilee and Judea, and Paul persecuted the church and tried to destroy it. Yet they're all listed as witnesses who saw Jesus alive again sometime after his death. This passage eliminates two skeptical responses to Jesus' resurrection, the legend hypothesis and the hallucination hypothesis. At the internet level, there are still people who claim that Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection arose through a process of legendary development over a period of many decades. But this is factually false. We know as a fact of history that the resurrection was the heart of Christian preaching from the beginning. You also may have heard people argue that Jesus' disciples simply hallucinated the resurrection appearances. But a hallucination, by definition, is something that occurs in the mind of the person experiencing it. If my friend Paul here takes a bunch of acid and a leprechaun appears to him, the rest of us aren't going to ask for his pot of gold because we're not going to see him. It's only in Paul's mind. The leprechaun doesn't exist outside of his mind. So we can't attribute the resurrection appearances to legend or hallucinations. Jesus appeared to multiple people on multiple occasions. Can we attribute them to deception? Were the disciples lying about the appearances? That's what I thought before I was a Christian. But there's a fatal flaw in the deception hypothesis. Liars make poor martyrs. Some human beings are willing to die for what they believe in. I've never met anyone who's willing to die for something he made up. In the book of Acts, chapter 4, Peter and John are arrested and threatened. In Acts 5, the apostles are put in jail and flogged. In Acts 12, James, the brother of John, is put to death by Herod, and Peter is again put in jail. The apostle Paul describes his life as a Christian in 2 Corinthians 11, 24 to 27. He writes, 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've spent in the deep. I've been on frequent journeys in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, and hunger and thirst, often without food, and cold and exposure. Become a Christian. It's a great life. The Jewish historian Josephus reports that James, the brother of Jesus, was stoned to death as a lawbreaker. Clement of Rome invites his readers to keep in mind the sufferings and martyrdoms of Peter and Paul. So the apostles didn't just preach that they had seen Jesus alive again. They were willing to endure prison, floggings, and death as they preached. And that means they really believed what they were saying. Here again, it's not just Christians who draw this conclusion. Even non-Christians maintain that the disciples sincerely believed that they had seen Jesus. Gerrit Ludemann, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which he appeared to them as the risen Christ. Bart Ehrman, we can say with complete certainty that some of his disciples at some later time insisted that he had soon appeared to them, convincing them that he had been raised from the dead. Bart Ehrman again, it is a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead soon after his crucifixion. Paula Fredrickson, I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw, but I do know as a historian they must have seen something.
As recorded in the book of Matthew, chapter 27, verses 62 through 67, at the time of crucifixion, Jewish chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. They said to Pilate the following, Sir, we remember that while Jesus was still alive, that deceiver Jesus said, quote, after 3 days I will rise again. Unquote. Thus, Pilate gave the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first. Pilate then answered by saying, "Take a guard, go, make the tomb as secure as you know how." So the Jewish priests went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard to keep watch. Thus the disciples couldn't have stolen the body, since the Jewish priests made sure of it by placing Roman guard soldiers to keep watch of the tomb. However, Roman guard soldiers were no match for the supernatural. While the Roman guards were keeping watch, a mighty earthquake came and a powerful bright angel came and took hold of the tomb. The guards ran away frightened. Also, the Roman guards were scared that they would be punished for not fulfilling their duty to keep watch. Some of the guards went into the city and reported to the Jewish chief priests everything that had happened. The chief priests soon met with the elders and devised a plan to cover up what happened with the angels. The Jewish priests gave the Roman guard soldiers a large sum of money and told them to say the following, quote, "His disciples came during the night and stole Jesus' body away while we were asleep," unquote. However, the soldiers were still scared that they would be punished by the governor for not fulfilling their orders to keep watch at night over the body of Jesus. The Jewish priests calmed the soldiers down by saying them, "If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. Another set of evidence for the empty tomb is the inclusion into the religious text gospel documents the testimony that women were the first eyewitnesses who state that they saw the empty tomb. In those days, women were seen as untrustworthy witnesses, and their testimony was not even admissible in legal cases. If the empty tomb story were really fabricated by the early Christians, it would not serve their case to be persuasive by making non-reputable women be the first to be eyewitnesses. In such a culture during that time, it is better to say that men were the first eyewitness in order to get more respect and credibility and to be persuasive. Yet, all four gospel accounts say that women were the first eyewitnesses of Jesus' empty tomb. Also, two gospels left out mentioning the two men that arrived at the empty tomb after the women discovered the tomb empty. The best explanation for this quirk in the accounts is that this is what actually occurred, that the Gospels record no more nor less than what truly happened. Jesus was being carried away for crucifixion. The disciples were scared to also be crucified with Jesus. They abandoned Jesus when Jesus was taken by the Roman guards. The disciples denied Jesus to everyone who accused them of being a follower of Jesus. The disciples had rejected Jesus and ran away when Jesus was captured. They were hiding and told people they don't know Jesus, and people began pressuring Peter to admit that Peter knows Jesus. Peter kept denying Jesus. But suddenly something happened. They soon say they saw Jesus. They said Jesus appeared to them and went through a door like a ghost, and Jesus also sat down with them and ate fish with the disciples at a disciple's home. Disciple Thomas wanted to touch Jesus, so Thomas put his hands in the hole mark of Jesus' pierced hands. They rejoiced like crazy and were very joyful to see Jesus alive again and resurrected. Jesus told them that after he himself ascends to the Father, the disciples should stay in Jerusalem and not leave until they receive what was promised from Father God. They will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit to have even more power to do greater miracles and be guided by all truth. This receiving of the promised gift of the Holy Spirit is mentioned in the book of John 7, verse 39. Also in John 14, verse 16, John 14:26, John 15, verses 26. Also, it is mentioned in Acts 1:4. After waiting in Jerusalem for the gift of the Holy Spirit, the Spirit came on them and they were soon filled with the Holy Spirit like Jesus had said. The disciples soon were joyous and excited, and they immediately spread the news and preached that Jesus is the Son of God. They were threatened by Jews to be killed, but they were too joyous and excited and fervent about Jesus as the Son of God. They were willing to be killed than deny what they had seen with their eyes. They were soon beaten and sentenced to death, but they didn't deny what they claim about Jesus as the Son of God. The direct disciples did not lie about witnessing Jesus rising from the dead, since no person is willing to face the death penalty for a knowingly self-made-up faith belief known lie and be also crucified, beheaded, or stoned for this made-up lie. Another way to put is by saying the following: people don't be willing to die for a faith belief they know 100% sure is lie. Paul was alive during the time of the disciples, and he was a highly respected Jewish priest Pharisee. He hated Christians and he was against Christianity. He had Christians put to death. Stephen was one of the early followers of Jesus. Paul ordered Stephen to be stoned, and Paul witnessed Stephen's death. Stephen became the first Christian martyr. Paul hunted more Christians down. Paul went to the high priest and asked for letters concerning permission so Paul can arrest and carry any Christian he sees at Damascus, and bring them to Jerusalem to be persecuted. While Paul was on the road on his way to Damascus to capture Christians, a blinding light came out from heaven and knocked Paul to the ground. Other group members with Paul also saw the light. A voice said to Paul the following quote, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Unquote. Paul answered, quote, "Who are you, Lord?" Unquote. A voice then responded the following quote, "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Rise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do." Unquote. The other group members was not able to hear the voice of Jesus. Because of the immense brightness of the light, Paul became blind. Paul could not see anything for 3 days, so he had to be guided by the other group members who were with him. He was so shocked witnessing Jesus tell Paul the sin Paul was doing. Paul immediately fasted, and he didn't even eat nor drank for 3 whole days. He prayed intensely. When Paul and his group reached the city of Damascus, Paul continued praying. Now there was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias. The Lord came to Ananias in a vision, and the Lord said to Ananias the following quote, "Arise and go to the street called Straight, and ask for Paul, for behold, he is praying." Unquote. Ananias soon sees himself in a vision laying his hands on Paul's eyes to heal Paul's blindness so that Paul might receive his sight. Then Ananias said to the Lord, quote, "Lord, I have heard from many people about this man, about how much harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priests to arrest all who call on your name." Unquote. The Lord said to Ananias, quote, "Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. For I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake." Unquote. And Ananias then went his way and entered the house of prayer and saw Paul. While laying his hands on Paul, Ananias said, quote, "Brother Paul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you came, has sent me that you may receive your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." Unquote. Immediately something like scales fell out of Paul's eyes, and immediately Paul received his sight back, and Paul went to get baptized. So when Paul had received food, he was strengthened after fasting. Then Paul spent some days with the disciples at Damascus. Immediately Paul preached in the synagogues that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Then all who heard Paul were amazed and said, quote, "Isn't this the man who killed the Christians, and isn't this man here at Damascus to capture the Christians?" Unquote. But Paul increased all the more in courage and was not shy, and he perplexed the Jews who dwelt in Damascus, proving that this Jesus is the Christ. Now after many days were passed, the Jews were angry at Paul and plotted to kill him. But their plot became known to Paul, and the Jews watched the entrance gates day and night to kill Paul. To help keep Paul safe, the disciples took Paul by night and let him down through the wall in a large basket in secret, so that the Jews don't see Paul. And when Paul had come to Jerusalem, he tried to join with the other new disciples, but the other new disciples were all afraid of Paul, and those disciples did not believe that Paul was a disciple. But Barnabas took Paul and brought Paul to the apostles. And Barnabas told the apostles how Paul had seen the Lord on the road to Damascus, and that the Lord had spoken to Paul on that road, and how Paul had preached boldly at Damascus in the name of Jesus. Barnabas mentioned that the Jews tried to kill Paul. Soon, the other new disciples trusted Paul. Paul in his travels preached across many lands, and for many years. Thousands were converted to Christianity. Paul was soon caught and was told to stop preaching, or else he would be beheaded and his neck would be chopped off. But Paul refused to deny Jesus. Paul was then beheaded and his neck was chopped off. Christianity kept increasing despite these events. Hundreds of thousands of people converted to become Christians over the many years. Miracles and healings of the Bible are still happening now. The Holy Spirit is alive, and Jesus said that the Holy Spirit will guide you in all truth. Seek God and pray earnestly to talk to God, just like Abraham talked to God. Pray and never stop praying, and try to seek the truth. God will reveal to you the truth. God bless you, brothers and sisters. Below this video, in the description, are miracle testimonies of current healings by God. Investigate to find the truth. Keep praying. Never stop praying. God bless you.
The Old Testament contains numerous prophecies about the death of the Messiah. If you were to read Isaiah 53 and you didn't know what you were reading, you would think that you were reading the New Testament. even though Isaiah was written 7 centuries before Jesus' death. That's how clear the passage is. But there's another kind of prediction to consider. In the New Testament, Jesus predicts his own death over and over again. For instance, in Mark 9:31, Jesus declares, "The Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later." Of course, the world is filled with people who don't trust the writings in the New Testament. Can we know that Jesus really predicted that he would be killed? Actually, yes. Dr. Mike Licona and Dr. Michael Brown explain.
That Jesus predicted his imminent death is something that is well attested. For example, we find it in the earliest source, the Gospel of Mark, in chapter 8, verses 31 and following. He predicts his death and resurrection, and Peter responds, "No, it can't be this way, Lord." And he rebukes Jesus, the Greek says. And Jesus responds and rebukes Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan, because you're focused on the things of man and not those of God." This fulfills the criterion of embarrassment, because you wouldn't make up something such as Peter, the lead disciple of Jesus, who would become a leader of the Christian church, his primary leader for several years. You wouldn't make up him rebuking his master, because that would be embarrassing and kind of discrediting for Peter. So it fulfills the criterion of embarrassment, but it also fulfills the criterion of early attestation, because Mark is our earliest gospel. We have Jesus predicting his death in Mark chapter 9 as well. We have Jesus predicting his death in John chapter 2. We have him predicting his death in the Q material in Matthew and Luke, where he talks about the sign of Jonah. So we have recurrent attestation as well. We also have Jesus predicting his death in the Eucharist sayings, when he's saying, "This is my body which is broken for you. This is the blood that I'm about to shed for the new covenant." So it's early, because that's also found in Paul. So we have multiple independent sources. We have early sources that are reporting Jesus predicting his imminent death.
It's fascinating in the Gospels that the disciples just don't get it when Jesus talks about he's going to die, because in their mind, Messiah is going to rule and reign. Now, we know there were different beliefs and traditions about the Messiah at that time, and we know that there were beliefs about a priestly Messiah and a royal Messiah. We find that in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, which comes a little bit later. But for sure, the most common concept would have been that the Messiah, son of David, will rule, reign, establish the kingdom. So, for example, in Matthew 16, with parallels in Mark 8 and Luke 9, we see that Peter recognizes, "You're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God." After which Jesus says, "Blessed are you, son of Bar Jonah, for flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven." And then Jesus from there begins to speak about his death. He's going to be beaten and crucified and all this. And Peter says, "Never, Lord. This will never happen to you." And then Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Peter didn't get it. The disciples didn't get it. When he plainly spoke that he's going to die and he's going to rise, they couldn't figure it out, because it was contrary to their paradigm. It would be like me teaching, now when Jesus comes in the clouds of heaven, he'll be shot down with a nuclear bomb, and then he's going to die, then he's going to rise. It's like, no, that's not going to happen. He's going to come in the clouds and set up his kingdom. That was the expectation. And what's interesting is you don't want to make your leaders look bad. You don't want to make the leaders like Peter, the apostles, look bad, but the Gospels tell the truth. They couldn't get it. They couldn't figure it out. It was so contrary to what they were expecting. And then in the Roman world, the Savior is going to be crucified. I mean, the most low and shameful and barbarous death. It was preposterous to them. So it's interesting that when he talks about he's going to die and rise, they talk to each other, what does he mean by rise? They can't figure it out. So the way it's recorded so clearly indicates that he spoke of it, that then after his resurrection, they realized he was telling us the whole time.
We have early independent sources reporting Jesus' predictions that he would be killed. Jesus' predictions occur in different genres, such as straightforward statements and parables. And the principle of embarrassment suggests that the embarrassing features of some of these passages make it extremely unlikely that the claims were later fabrications. So, what does this mean? Well, Jesus predicting his own death by itself isn't really a problem for atheists because it doesn't require miraculous foreknowledge. If you know that there are people who are trying to kill you, and you know you're going to an area where they'll have the opportunity to kill you, you can predict your own death. So, this isn't something that should bother atheists. But it is something that should bother Muslims, because Muslims claim to believe that Jesus always spoke the truth. Why is this a problem for Muslims? Back to Dr. Licona.
In the Quran, Surah 4, verse 157, it says that God only made it appear that Jesus died, but he actually didn't. God made it appear that way and took Jesus to heaven. Now, against the Quran, we have historical evidence that Jesus predicted his imminent death. We have it in Mark, we have it in Paul, we have it all over. It's recurrent sources that Jesus predicted his death, and his death is reported by even non-Christian sources. Now, of course, we might say that a Muslim might respond and say, well, that just shows that the Quran is correct because God made it appear that way. But there's another answer that really just blows that one out of the saddle. Jesus predicted his own imminent death. So if he predicted his death and he did not die, then that makes him a false prophet. But the Quran calls Jesus a great prophet. So the Quran would be mistaken that Jesus was a great prophet. The other alternative is that Jesus actually did die as he predicted. But in that case, the Quran would be mistaken when it says in Surah 4 that he did not. In either case, the Quran is mistaken. So the only answer that a Muslim can give to this is that Jesus really didn't predict his imminent death. But we have really good historical evidence that he did. So a Muslim is going to have to refute that evidence.
So we can establish historically that Jesus predicted his own imminent death. If Jesus was right about dying, and he did die, then the Quran is wrong, because the Quran says that Jesus didn't die. If Jesus was wrong about dying, then the Quran is still wrong, because the Quran affirms that Jesus was a prophet. Either way, the Quran is wrong. For Muslims who would throw history out the window in order to preserve their confidence in the Quran, there's another problem here. The Quran affirms the inspiration, preservation, and authority of the Christian scriptures, the very scriptures that declare over and over again that Jesus predicted his own death. Once again, we have two possibilities. Either the Christian scriptures are the inspired, preserved, authoritative Word of God, or they aren't. If Christians have the inspired, preserved, authoritative Word of God, the Quran is wrong, because the Quran contradicts the Christian scriptures on basic teachings, like Jesus predicting his own death. If Christians don't have the inspired, preserved, authoritative Word of God, the Quran is still wrong, because the Quran affirms the inspiration, preservation, and authority of the Christian scriptures. Either way, the Quran is wrong. For you Muslims who are busy typing, "Stop lying, the Quran never affirms your corrupted Christian scriptures," you're once again proving that you don't read your own sources. Instead, you continue believing what your imams tell you, not what your God and your prophet tell you. Do yourself a favor and watch my video, The Quran, the Bible, and the Islamic Dilemma. Then, once you see for the first time in your life what your God and your prophet actually say about the Christian scriptures, be sure to ask yourself, why have my leaders kept these passages hidden from me? Why do my leaders want to keep me in a state of ignorance about what the Quran really says? And if my leaders are lying about this, what else are they lying about?